All right. Welcome, everybody. You're very welcome to this new virtual seminar series on conservation impact evaluation and implementation science. My name is Johanna Eklund, and together with Paul Ferraro and Sebastian Kostedot, we'll be hosting today's session. And this is actually an idea that came up during the previous ICCB conference, and I'm really happy to see so many of you here and even more people registered who want to access the recording later on. As you have seen from the program, we have an absolute all-star lineup of speakers who will share their insights once a month with us, always on the first Tuesday of every month, same time. And briefly on the program. So today we'll start with Paul Ferraro on the past and the future of impact evaluations, followed then by Julia Jones next month on whether conservation works and how we can know it. Then we take a short break for holidays during July and August, and then we are back from September onwards, starting with Johan Olderkop on multiple outcomes and multiple policies, followed then in October with Erin Sills on synthetic control methods, and then in November we have Sabrina Eisenbart with harmonized implementation experiments. And then we thought that we'll end this year on the 6th of December with a panel on challenges and opportunities, then involving more people on this expert panel. And then hopefully, if there still is an interest, we are really looking forward to also continue on next year's side. But this is what we kind of have set up for the moment. Briefly, some housekeeping rules. So we'll start with the talk, and then that will be followed by a moderated Q&A session. And for the Q&A session, you can participate by posting questions in the chat. And then Seb will be moderating those, posing them forward to Paul. If you find it helpful, you should be able to activate the live transcript function in Zoom, and you'll find this under the More button and then Live Transcript. And as you already noticed when you entered, this seminar is being recorded, and the recordings will later on be available on the Society for Conservation Biology's own Vimeo channel. And you can find the address here. We'll also post it in the chat window. We are really hoping that you will engage with us also on social media. And for that, you can use the hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. And please do also tag the I Do Impact account. So then briefly, what is the I Do Impact account standing for? So that is the Society for Conservation Biology's Impact Evaluation Working Group. And before we start with the talk of today, I just wanted to say a few words about the work we are doing. So we are one of the newer working groups of the Society. We currently only have provisional status, but we are of course very keen on expanding and looking for more members. And our aim is to advance evidence-based conservation efforts across the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. And if you are interested to get involved or to find out more, then please check our homepage with instructions of how you can sign up, for example, for the email list that we are hosting. But now over to today's talks. So it's a great honor for me to invite Professor Paul Ferraro of Johns Hopkins University to this virtual floor. And I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Paul's work because he has truly revolutionized conservation science. Always, at least I feel that he has always been pushing us to become better at evaluating impact and carrying out causal inference studies. Paul is actively collaborating across the disciplinary boundaries, and I think this has led him to introduce a lot of novel ideas to conservation science. And at least on a more personal note, I can still actually remember the first time that I read his seminal paper, Money for Nothing, published in 2006 together with Patanayak. but this is already some time ago, and lots have happened since then. At least that's what I'm hoping. So Paul kindly agreed to give a talk where he reflects back to where it all started, and then share some of his thoughts of where he sees us sort of this field advancing in the future. So please, Paul, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak.
Thanks, Joanna, and welcome everybody. So we decided to make these seminars roughly 30 minutes to give opportunities for people to do questions and have the speakers answer. So please feel free to use the chat box. But with only 30 minutes, it's going to be tough to deliver on the grandiose title of the past and the future for conservation impact evaluations and implementation science. So what I'm going to try to do is just to briefly use the first half of my talk to talk about how far we've come. I'm not going to cover all the people that have been involved. It's not just me. There's been lots of people involved in pushing this agenda forward in conservation science, and try to focus on the constraints that still exist to advancing this field further. And then spend the other half of the talk trying to describe advances that I hope we'll see over the next 10 years in this field. So when Joanna asked me to do the first seminar for this series, she said, you'd be a good person to do it because you've been around since the beginning. And I thought, did Joanna just call me old? But she's right, I have been doing this for a while. And so after I got over my initial shock that I'm now the old person that will prattle around about the old days, I went back and looked at my old folders, and I realized it was nearly 20 years to the day that I submitted a proposal to the US National Science Foundation for a randomized controlled trial for payments for environmental services in Bolivia. And on that proposal was David Wilkie, an ecologist from Wildlife Conservation Society, Ricardo Godoy, a cultural anthropologist from Brandeis University, and Dean Carlin, a development economist from Yale University. And we were interested in trying to measure the ecological, the cultural, and the economic effects of these PES programs and the mechanisms through which they operate. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds like a great project, I had never heard of it, it's because we couldn't get it funded. We spent 3 years going to everyone, science foundations. We went to philanthropic organizations like MacArthur, bilaterals and multilaterals like World Bank. We could not get anyone interested. People said things like, we're already doing monitoring evaluation. Why do you need to do this experiment? Every time PES is launched, we're doing monitoring evaluation. We're going to learn that way. People said that experiments are just lazy, that if you just collected more data, then you would actually know and you have a richer understanding of what's going on in those interventions. People said it was unethical to do this experiment. Giving some people rewards, not other people rewards. And some people say, why would you do this, spend this much money on a single intervention when there are already studies looking at the determinants of land use change, the determinants of invasive species. They have all the drivers there. You're just looking at one little driver, and people can do it at the global level. You're just doing it at one area in Bolivia. And you still hear those comments today, and we'll talk about some of those constraints, but that actually is why I moved into non-experimental observational impact evaluation, because I couldn't get anything done. And I believe it was Subrendu Patnaik who said, why don't you just do some observational work and abandon the experiments for a while? And the challenge we had when we started doing the non-experimental work, not just me, is that there were very few people 15 years ago that knew both the methods and the conservation context. And I thought I would just share with you, I'm going to share my screen now, what kind of reviews we used to get back then. I'm going to minimize this. Don't see everybody. So this is a paper that looked at the Endangered Species Act in the US, the impacts on species status. And we tried to submit it to science journals. Got lots of DEX rejections, usually no explanation, but PNAS editor did give us an explanation. And what he basically said was, I don't really believe these results, but the only person that's going to be able to review this is someone who knows both the methods and the conservation context, and there isn't anybody like that. So reject. The next year, we didn't get discouraged, right? So we said, okay, we have this other paper on protected area impacts. And we said, okay, let's try again. And this time, we still have the challenge that the reviewers would either be method specialists or they'd be conservation specialists, but rarely are there people that did both. But at least the editor sent it out to those kinds of specialists. And I just pulled from the referee reports 2 comments that I think really describe what it was like 15 years ago trying to do this work. We had the method specialist who basically said the authors described the literature on impacts in conservation field, even in top science journals, as one in which the treatment assignment process and confounding variables are ignored. What do they mean by treatment assignment process? Why are some units protected and other units are not? Confounding variables, these are things that affect what's protected and also affect the outcomes that we're looking at. And they said, if this characterization is correct, and I find it hard to believe it is in the 21st century, then this study is an important advance. They basically said, I don't think this is much of an advance, but if they're right, then this is an advance. And then when you look at the referee report from the conservation specialist, they wrote, the word confounding is mentioned many times in the paper. I'm not aware of that as a technical term, although I vaguely understand what it means. You should define it and give examples, which we did. But just sort of juxtapositions that there was this huge advances going on in other fields, but conservation really hadn't been aware of some of these advances. And we've come, I mean, miles and miles from that initial starting point. There's been lots of people working on this. We have lots of people now in the field that have both conservation expertise and methodological expertise. And I can think of no better anecdote or example to bolster my claim that we've come so far. So when nearly 600 people registered for this seminar, 250 of them here today. And I know that if we'd done this 15 years ago, we maybe had 30 or 40 people show up. Most of them in very traditional process-oriented single project evaluation folks, important stuff, but very few would have been interested or skilled to look at trying to approximate counterfactual outcomes for attribution, for impact evaluations in our conservation interventions. And I bet that a big proportion of the people that are on today have those interests and those skills. And so, although we've made huge advances in doing impact evaluations kind of after the fact, there's still one serious constraint to doing better. It's part of the reason why the seminar series has this phrase in it, implementation science. So people may have heard me say this before. I haven't said it in writing, but I've said in lots of presentations and Twitter, that in conservation, science typically stops when implementation starts. What I mean by that is that we spend a huge amount of effort applying a scientific lens to understanding conservation problems, right? Measuring with increasing precision indicators of status and trends of ecosystems and species, trying to understand, well, how do we best intervene? And then when we do intervene and we implement our solutions, science sort of stops, right? And then what we have is sort of these opportunistic impact evaluations afterward. But that's a problem, right? Joanna mentioned this paper with Subrenda Patnaik in 2006. And a lot of people view it as we were emphasizing counterfactual thinking. We were bringing to conservation as these designs that are being used in other fields to estimate impacts. But part of the push that we're also making in that article is that we're missing opportunities for learning from conservation interventions. Right? And I pulled a quote from that paper that sort of summarizes that we've got thousands of projects every year and none of them is designed in a way that permits an evaluation of effectiveness. Now, none, I wouldn't use that word anymore, but it's still very few. And so what this seminar series is partially pushing is not only improvements in impact evaluations and advancing the frontier, but trying to promote conservation implementation science. Now, if you Google that phrase, implementation science, it's largely coming from medicine and there's lots of different definitions of it. What I mean by it is that we should be applying the same scientific lens to implementation that we apply when trying to understand conservation problems and the designs of solutions to those problems. And what I'm talking about is scientist practitioner collaborations that are embedded in field operations with a particular focus on understanding how interventions work or don't work, so that they can be made more effective. And we don't do this in conservation. And so we end up having these opportunistic impact evaluations, and they're certainly much more advanced than they were before. But this is a key problem, that we're not designing the programs with the intention of implementing that. So part of this is this rhetorical technique of creating a new phrase, implementation science. As I'll talk about later, I also think that also reduces some of the negative perspective that a lot of program people have on evaluation, where they think they're being evaluated rather than the program. But particularly, I think this is a way that we need to advance conservation science if we're going to get better evidence about what works and under what conditions. And so the question is, well, why aren't we doing it? Right? Other fields are doing it, why don't we do it? And I think there are three primary constraints. The first one is an ethical constraint, that our guiding ethical precept in conservation doesn't encourage us to apply a scientific lens to implementation. So what do I mean by that? Right? We don't have a formal guiding ethical precept in conservation, but one of my main motivations for doing this work, for impact evaluation, is I feel it's an ethical obligation. We're mucking around in poor people's lives in low and middle income countries. We're messing around with endangered species and endangered ecosystems. We have an ethical obligation to figure out, what is it that we're doing? Is our understanding of the world accurate? When we push on all these levers, are we actually moving the system in a desirable direction or not? Right? But conservation has an ethical precept. If I had to characterize it, it'd be primum est agere. First, do something. Right? Conservation is a crisis discipline. Everything's going down. We need to act now. Right? We can learn as we go along. Right? But this ethical precept doesn't lend itself to saying, hey, wait a minute. Before we go scaling things up, we need to figure out whether or not this is actually working the way we think it should be working. And so I think if we borrowed from medicine the guiding ethical precept, the primum non nocere, first do no harm, people would take implementation science and impact evaluations a lot more seriously in conservation. Right? That we'd realize that we have an ethical obligation to understand what works and under what conditions. And does our model of how these coupled human natural systems operate, is it valid? Does it work? Right? And if we were doing this, we would start to view conservation interventions as hypotheses to be tested rather than good ideas to be applied broadly. We often have this idea that, of course, it's a good idea, or at worst, maybe it doesn't work as well as we think it does, but we should just do it. But if we had a first do no harm perspective, we might say, no. We first have to work out whether this actually works as advertised. Right, so that needs to be taken care of. The ethical precept, I think, needs to change in conservation, but it's still, we have this major constraint that over the last 15 years, I've realized is the dominant problem we have in conservation, is that we don't have incentives to do this work. Right? Everybody says evidence is really valuable. We need more evidence. We're not generating it. Why is that? So I'm going to talk about why conservation scientists don't have the right incentives later. But here I just want to talk about practitioners. All right, so let's imagine we have two candidates. Right, Paul Ferraro A, and we're deciding whether to hire, promote, or fund Paul Ferraro A. Now, as I look at my picture, I realized I think I had exactly the same jacket and shirt on. I just revealed to several hundred people that I only own one nice outfit. Nevertheless, so we've got Paul Ferraro A. In the last 5 years, he says, I've managed $4 million for 3 interventions. All 3 achieved measurable improvements on important conservation performance indicators and received a lot of media attention. I'm seeking an opportunity to scale these successes up. Paul Ferraro B is the second candidate, identical in all respects, except he has a different pitch. He says, in the last 5 years, I've managed $4 million for 3 interventions. All 3 failed to yield performance indicators that were measurably better than the status quo. But I learned that 2 of the dominant models for achieving conservation were flawed, and I have new ideas to test. Which one's going to get hired, promoted, or funded? And don't lie to yourself, right? We've been around long enough to know that Paul Ferraro A has a leg up, right? Because we incentivize conservation success, right? Not learning. And the anecdote, I mean, I've got lots of stories in favor of that, but the best one I can think of is when I was the science advisor for biodiversity at the Global Environment Facility, collaborating with the staff there. Mark Zimsky worked to get a set aside of funds in the biodiversity portfolio, $5 million to any projects in the Jeff portfolio for biodiversity that was interested in deliberately designing their intervention to be evaluated. And so in particular, there was money available to help bring in expertise, to help the team design it, and bring in money for measuring outcomes in a comparison set of areas, communities, whatever it might be, so that there would be a way to estimate the counterfactual. 4 years of those funds were available. No one took up those funds. Money just sitting there to do this, to generate evidence, do implementation science. Nobody wanted that money. To me, that was the clearest indication that was something wrong with the incentives, that we're not rewarding learning. That's what we need to be doing, right? So from the top of these organizations, bilaterals, multilaterals, government agencies, big NGOs and small NGOs, we say that we do this, but we don't. I've talked to lots of people in conservation organizations who do not feel like they get rewarded for learning. They get rewarded for conservation success from their bosses, from their donors, funding organizations. This is a big barrier to making advances in impact evaluation and implementation science. All right, and the third barrier is one that I've been working on for a long time, and not alone. Lots of people have been working on this, trying to educate conservation scientists and practitioners how best to do impact evaluations and implementation science. And although we've made a lot of advances, there are still some constraints on doing this, particularly within conservation organizations. I'm just going to give you one story from 9 years ago, where I gave a presentation to the Biodiversity Funders Group, which used to be called the Consultative Group on Biodiversity. This is a group of philanthropic organizations, donors who give a lot of money to biodiversity conservation projects. And I was pitching the money for nothing argument that we need to design these programs better so that we can learn from these programs. And the reaction I got are summarized in some of the quotes on the right-hand side there. Every single program and project we do is subject to M&E. What are you talking about, Ferraro? We allocate 10% of every budget to M&E, usually by third parties, independent groups, right? Others say we engage in learning by doing. We're continually learning about what works and doesn't work and fine-tuning accordingly. And these statements, which you may actually recognize from your own organization, these are problematic from my perspective. So the first thing is that if we're going to really learn in a way that helps us improve implementation generally across our conservation portfolio, not every project or program should be evaluated for impacts. Now, this idea of assigning a fixed percentage for every project, that's not a good way of using our scarce resources. We should be strategically investing in evaluation in interventions that are likely to really shed important light that's going to be generalizable beyond that particular project, that have a good chance of actually allowing us to attribute cause to effect and or effect to cause, and to be able to understand the mechanisms. Do we understand the world correctly in the way in which it operates? The other thing is that evaluation should be part of the program design before the program starts, not something you do after the program or during the program. Right? And this is a problem with lots of organizations where the evaluation group is off to the side in the organogram of the organization. And the reason for that is because we want these evaluation groups to be independent. Right? If they have too much stake in the program, then that might warp how they view it. We need to have people who are objective. But the downside of that is they're not involved in program design, and therefore they get all these programs that weren't designed to be evaluated, to allow learning or facilitate learning. And so we don't actually have good evaluation evidence from a lot of those interventions. Learning by doing, that is extremely challenging. Right? This idea that when you look at all these impact evaluation techniques, those look super sophisticated. The most challenging kind of learning is learning by doing, when you're in the midst of it, trying to take aspirin and realize or figure out if it actually improves your health outcomes. That is super challenging to do. And the other thing is you're not going to learn anything unless you explicitly reward learning and don't punish failures. And we don't do that explicitly in most organizations. All right, so these are 3 constraints: implementation science. I think really, I used to think information was the main constraint. I think at this point, it's the ethical and incentives that are the problem for making advances in this area. But with the rest of my time, I wanted to talk about what I think is next. And again, I don't have a lot of time to talk about all the things I would love to talk about, but I want to focus on 3 particular actions that I hope we'll be seeing over the next 10 years in conservation science and practice. So the first is related to what I've already been talking about, that we need to foster a culture of experimentation and deliberate designs for implementation science within conservation organizations. All right, so, and to do that, the first thing we have to do is get everybody to recognize that we run thousands of uncontrolled experiments every year. And not only does that make it really difficult to learn from all these interventions, but it's also unethical. And we have an ethical obligation to take some of these uncontrolled experiments and turn them into controlled experiments. All right, so that's going to be more use of randomized designs, but also other creative quasi-experimental designs, like manipulation of eligibility rules, which people, households, species, areas are eligible for intervention, which are not. If we can manipulate those eligibility rules, we can create discontinuities that will allow us to at least evaluate impacts for a subgroup and mechanisms, or construct synthetic controls before we intervene and allow that to guide where exactly we intervene, only in areas that have good synthetic controls. If you don't know what that means, Erin Sills is going to be presenting on the synthetic control method, which has a lot of promise for conservation. I think it's underutilized. I think she's talking in October. And if we're going to do this sort of work, we need to protect jobs and egos. One thing I've learned from trying to do this over the last 20 years is a bad design is to say, let's test whether your program works or not. Because the way in which field people hear that is, let's test whether you versus you don't exist, what the difference is in those 2 states of the world. Do you matter? Nobody wants to be evaluated in that particular kind of framing. You need to be better off trying for, here's the status quo, let's try a version of that that you think would improve upon that. That's going to give us better insights into implementation, and it's also going to be a safer environment for field people to collaborate in versus one in which they feel like they're personally being evaluated. All right, so I know there's a lot of people might get upset when they hear Ferraro talking about, I realize the bottom there is a different presentation, but that's okay, that I'm trying to create a Trojan horse for randomization and conservation science. And my response is, look, we can argue about exactly how much of our scarce resources should be allocated to researcher practitioner partnerships for controlled experimentation within conservation programs, but we're at 0 right now. Now, 0 is not the optimal. I find it hard to believe that from a social scientific perspective, 0% of our portfolio, right? There are a few projects out there that have done this, but it's essentially 0 when you look in the larger ocean of projects that are out there. That cannot be optimal. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that in the next decade. All right, next, for non-experimental work, I'm hoping that we can ensure some of the basics for these kind of designs become standard operating procedures. I still don't see it. So what do I mean by the basics? Every impact evaluation should start with the selection story, the treatment assignment mechanism. Why are some areas protected and others are not? Why are some areas exposed to this conservation intervention of some species and others are not? That is the very starting point. Like I still see lots of articles that say, I'm going to use a matching estimator with regression, supplement, and I've got 20 confounding variables on the control for, see table 1. And no story about like, why are those the right confounding variables? Like, what do you know about program implementation over space or time that makes these the right variables to control for? And then once you've clarified the selection story, that will point you to a design, then you're going to clarify what assumptions are you making for attribution, right? For an effect to a cause, an intervention to the outcomes. And whether it's contribution or attribution, you've got to clarify the assumptions you're making. We still do not do that in lots of studies and reports from organizations when we do evaluations. All right, the other thing we need to do is we need to include baselines. If you're going to control for confounding factors, it's super hard to do with things that are observed post-treatment that have nothing to do with the outcome, or I should say that are not the outcome. 20 years ago, this was really hard to do, to condition on pre-treatment outcomes, pre-intervention outcomes, but increasingly we have these large longitudinal data sets. We should be doing more of this, because lots of other fields have shown that if you don't or can't condition on pre-intervention outcomes, super hard to control for the selection biases that arise in most non-experimental contexts. Other thing that we need to see more of, I hardly ever see this at all, is sensitivity analyses to those causal assumptions. And I see lots of sensitivity analyses, robustness checks of myriad models that use essentially the same assumptions to draw inferences about impacts. Right? And not surprisingly, they generally show that the effects are robust to changing the model specification or making it nonlinear or changing the definition of treatment or how we define the outcome. But the big issue is maybe those causal assumptions are wrong. That if we condition on these variables, for example, we have an as if randomized intervention. And so we need some way to probe or interrogate these causal assumptions and say, what if I'm wrong? Can I bound the effect? Is it possible that I got this completely wrong? We don't see a lot of that. Again, I don't think in science or in practice we have incentives to do it, but we need to start doing this more. We need to have a better sense of just how uncertain we are about those assumptions and how much it might matter in practice. The other thing is that, and people have been saying this for a long time, is that we want to know not just what the impact is, but how is it or not, how is it arising or not arising? And to do that, we're going to need to have better theories on how these programs work. There's been a lot of push in the last 15 years by others trying to get these clearer logic models or get these theories of changes in our programs. So we've made strides there, but we're going to need to be very clear on how do we think these programs work. We're going to need more sophisticated designs. Most of the designs doing mechanism analysis are doing it indirectly, including some of my work those are not very strong designs for doing mechanism analyses. And part of the reason why they're not strong is because we don't have measures of the mechanisms themselves. And this is a problem. And if we were more deliberate about our design of interventions, we might collect some of that information and have a lot more light shed on the mechanisms through which these programs work. There's going to be a presentation in November by Sabrina Eisenbarth about doing coordinated experiments across multiple countries. And one of the nice things about that is not only do they have evidence about whether the intervention works or not to affect resource use, but they also were able to evaluate what mechanisms are operative and found that it wasn't the ones that people thought would be most operative. All right, so what else do we need? Mixed methods, right? So I pushed a lot on causal inference, but I recognize that mixed methods are absolutely essential, and we need more work on how best to use them. And I'm hoping that in the next 10 years that mixed methods will be a synonym for triangulation using multiple designs and methods, and not a euphemism for can't do a more credible analysis, so this is what we're doing, and I'm calling it mixed methods, which I see in quite a few papers, that we're really using mixed methods in a rigorous way that really sheds light on a lot of the facets of the problem that we're wrestling with. The last one, this gets to the problem with incentives for scientists to not generate high quality evidence, is to pre-register your hypotheses, right? Pre-register your hypotheses. What is the intervention exactly that you're studying? What are the outcomes you think are going to be affected? If you think there are subgroups that are more or less likely to be affected, what are those subgroups? Registers before you see the data. And even better, have a pre-analysis plan. It says exactly how you're going to do the analysis. And so if you've never heard of pre-registration or pre-analysis plans, just Google it. There's lots of push on this and lots of other scientific disciplines. And just to give you an illustration of why I think it's important, I love this figure from a paper about 7 years ago that's looking at clinical trials from the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, United States. Each one of these circles is an estimated effect of an intervention on a health outcome in terms of relative risk. So if the estimated effect is 1, that means that the new intervention does no better than the status quo, no better, no worse. If you're below 1, the intervention has reduced the risk of a bad health outcome compared to the status quo. If you're above the 1, you've actually made things worse. You've increased the risk. What you can see is that for about 30 years of these trials, most of the trials find that the interventions reduce risk of bad health outcomes compared to the status quo. Most of them are statistically significant. Very few go in the opposite direction, and those that do are not statistically significant. And then what happens in the year 2000, the Institute required that all the primary outcomes were going to be registered in advance before they actually did the trial. And what you see is that all the estimated impacts collapse toward 1, meaning that the interventions seem to work no better than the status quo. There's a few that seem to work better. There's some that seem to work worse than the status quo. This is what conservation science should look like. This is what impact evaluation should look like in conservation science. And they know about this in other fields. We should not expect large effects from actions. We should expect effects that are going the opposite sign. But when you read a lot of the conservation science literature, this is not what we see. Right? And why not? Because scientists don't have incentives to produce a figure that looks like that, right? They have incentives to produce effect sizes of large magnitudes in the desired direction, precisely estimated. And that's actually not what we will see very frequently. And we need to recognize that and create incentives for conservation scientists to do a better job in the science. The last thing I want to push on, right? So get the basics done. We need to do that. But a lot of impact evaluation is causal inference, right? You can call it evaluation, you can call it implementation science, but a lot of it is trying to attribute an effect to a cause. And there's a lot of work that's being done on this, right, in the broader methodological field. And we need to be near that frontier. And I was going to focus this particularly on this idea of combining causal designs and machine learning. Machine learning is very much about prediction, right? If I see a bunch of attributes of the ecosystem, I can predict whether a species is there or not. That's what that's good for. Causal analysis, though, is not what machine learning is good for, is pushing on levers and seeing what actually changes in the system. Right? But when we're trying to get to the truth, right, we're estimating what we think the impacts are, but we're going to be off by some amount. Right? That amount that we're off by is a function of these hidden biases, these confounders, misspecification, and how we're modeling the relationship between the treatment and the outcome. Is it linear or nonlinear? And noise, sampling variability, chance. Right? Now, the hidden bias is going to be best addressed by design choices, causal assumptions, story about selection. Can't get away from that. But the other issues, misspecification bias and dealing with sampling variability and noise, may be better addressed by algorithmic machine learning approaches. Right? And so if you haven't read about doubly robust machine learning estimators, these seem to be like where the field is going, trying to combine the best of causal inference and machine learning to get higher quality evidence about what's working and through what mechanisms. And I'll just give an advertisement for the Society for Causal Inference. If you haven't heard of it, there's the website. They have some online seminars. They have a conference happening in a few weeks. This would be one of many opportunities for trying to move yourself along to the frontier. I'm not at the frontier. I'm trying to move along to it. I'd love it if there's other people to help move me toward it. All right. I'm just going to end on that note because I'm out of time, and I want to open it up to a Q&A for people in the audience or my co-hosts. Thanks for your time.
Wow, that was wonderful, Paul. Very good overview of your experience and the effort you are pioneer and the vision to move forward. So we have a lot of questions, so I've tried to group them to start the discussion. And so let's start by asking about something about collaboration. What do you think is a question from Jan Dixon? What do you think is the best or more compelling example where a greater focus on impact evaluation or implementation science has or is helping to solve a conservation problem?
So you saw that penultimate slide that I put up there. I didn't go over them. I'm just going to throw it up real quickly. I think this is what you're asking. What evidence do we have about the value of evidence? And does evidence matter? And there's actually a part of political science that argues that it does not. And that's the second part of implementation science in medicine. It's actually become the major focus after the last 10 years because they have so many more clinical trials, and they're figuring out how do we translate that? How do we get policymakers to take this evidence up? I don't have any great examples, right? And this is one of the things that also is the frontier is how do we get people to take up evidence and be more engaged in this? And I'll tell you, I think the problem comes down to incentives, right? So we've done embedded experiments into operations. They typically don't find an impact. That's demoralizing to people. That was a waste of time. I wanted to find an impact. I don't want to do that again. It's an incentive problem that people don't find that there's a gain from finding out what doesn't work. There's often an asymmetry there. So I wish I could give you examples where evidence and conservation implementation science was transformative. It changed the way in which people thought about what they did and how they operated. I don't have examples. I have examples where individuals within conservation organizations were influenced. I don't know if Sheila Reddy is on the call from the Nature Conservancy, but I think her engagement in some of this work with TNC changed how she views her job and how she operates within TNC. But from an organizational level, Ian, I don't have it. So I think that's an excellent question and one that should be pursued more vigorously and rigorously.
And Sheila is here today.
I didn't mischaracterize that. But yeah.
Okay, a slightly related question from Caroline Ward. Have you seen any movement from the policy side asking for evaluation? I mean, not adapting for evaluation, but asking. Right.
So no, I do a lot of these presentations, right? So I think some people from Pew Charitable Trust are here. I gave a presentation, and I do a lot of these presentations for organizations, American Development Bank, World Bank, for the environmental groups. Everybody says they want evidence, but very few are actually doing anything about it. And so that's why I really have come down on the ethical precept is all wrong and the incentives are all wrong in these organizations. I do believe them. They're not lying to me that they want more evidence. It's just they want someone else to generate the evidence. Right? To do it within their own operation is incredibly risky. There's a downside risk and not much upside risk, given how the incentives are structured. And so I've got money from U.S. Department of Agriculture to run a center that's supposed to embed. And we have a huge challenge with everybody wants us to embed it in someone else's program, right? Because they want to learn, but they don't want it to be in their program. And part of this is because they're not rewarded for it. Basically, it's a public good. We're asking people to incur private costs for the public good. And we should know that that is challenging. That's why we have all the environmental problems we have, same misaligned incentives.
Okay, so talking about these incentives and how we can put that in practice, we have a question from Diogo Verissimo, and he's asking, deciding what to evaluate and to what detail is the key decision. What are some principles NGOs, for example, should be using to make those decisions?
Thanks for that question, Diogo. So I think this is the other thing that people don't understand about a lot of the people working in impact evaluations. We're not just interested in whether that project worked or not. We're looking for generalizable principles about how the world operates. And often we have these debates going on within our organizations, like what the best way to intervene. Should we be expanding protected areas or should we be investing more in the protected areas we have? Should we be providing technical assistance to people so they understand how they can operate in more environmentally friendly ways, or should we be providing financial assistance? Right? There's all these debates. We should be finding vehicles where we can sort of adjudicate these competing visions of how the world works. Are polluters rational or are they irrational? And so those are the best ways to to find studies for doing strong implementation science, where shedding light on this particular instance of implementation is going to shed light on these broader debates that we have that seem to be interminable, because we have observational data that is favor and against, that we have more deliberate designs to try to adjudicate between these competing visions of how the world works. That would be the ideal. And then I also think that if you can't do that, then anyone would be fine to create this culture of experimentation. A lot of people have noted, oh, Paul, I see that you're a behavioral economist now, largely because that's the only thing I can get a lot of institutions willing to experiment with, is a bunch of these psychological tricks to get people to change their behavior. And also, if you can't do the ideal, do something where you're trying to foster this idea of testing, learning, adapting, testing, learning, adapting, because that would be maybe get them on the road to doing more important or substantive implementation science.
Okay, so following up on the implementation science and the capacity, there is different question from Nick Vischer and relatively from Sarah Carlson, asking, are there attempts to grow a professional cadre of evaluator for this work if one doesn't already exist? And similar question from Nick was, what are some of the major consultancies who work with NGO to infuse monitoring and evaluation into their work and intervention? So it's really, you need an evaluator. What do you do?
So can you just repeat that first question? I didn't quite understand.
Oh yeah, sorry for my French. Don't put difficult work for me. So let me give you the context. At my organization, we sometimes bump up against a lack of evaluators familiar with these methods for conservation. Are there attempts to grow a professional cadre of evaluators for this work?
Yeah, so there was some initiatives to do that, but I don't think so. I think it's happening in a very loose sort of network way. And that's part of the problem, because there is an evaluator world. And I think I'm hoping are part of this audience that have been around for a while and have been working on this for a long time. And then there's sort of the scientist groups that have been coming in and doing impact evaluation. And unfortunately, I see often a conflict between those groups, which is, I think, unproductive. I think both groups have a lot to offer each other, but I don't see, there was an environmental evaluators network that was created through some people at the EPA and some others that didn't really take off. We could do an autopsy and try to talk about why, but I'm hoping that maybe the team counterfactual will be one way to do that through these seminars, and maybe some other ways of doing training and capacity building and creating a cadre for doing that. I think it's important. I don't think one really exists, although the attendance on this seminar shows that even without it, we've been making advances, and that's great to see. Did I get the second part of that question? I don't quite know.
As far as I understand it, I think so. I mean, there were some questions related to specific consultancies, but probably I encourage the people to contact you to specific names. And where I
while you're looking for that, that's what I meant on the constituency side. One thing I've seen happening in the US government that seems positive is that for the Evidence-Based Policy Act that they created, that's pushing agencies to develop evidence about whether what they're doing actually works and in the ways that they think it does, is that they've created not evaluation agendas, but learning agendas. Again, trying to change this idea that you're being evaluated, right, as a program person, which is, none of us want to be evaluated. That does not promote honesty and transparency. But a learning agenda where that's all we're doing, we're learning, and what you're being evaluated on is, did you have a good learning design, and did you learn something that's credible, right? That's what you're being evaluated on. I think that is the right move for developing constituencies for this. Because if people feel like there's safe space for learning, people do want to learn. But I think that's part of the problem, is that there isn't that space. And I think part of the problem is this, just the framing of this word evaluation, I've realized is just not conducive to people wanting to do transparent learning.
Great. So we have a very interesting clarification question from probably many from NGO practitioners, from Charles Latremouille. How much of your recommendation do we meet by adopting the conservation standards? I think he's referring to the open standards for the practice of conservation.
Right. So I have not looked at the standards in a while, but also I'm going on my just being in that environment for a long time when they were being developed. I think they would help a lot if they were. The thing I worry about is that those are very much focused on that first end, these theories of change, which is super important, and saying, you know, what are you gonna monitor to get a sense of whether or not things are working or not? And I think those are great for most projects. And what I worry about with the standards is they're not pushing us toward the frontier, because they're designed really that everybody can do this sort of work. And that's important, I think. But it's the sort of the equivalent of having sort of standards for best practices for monitoring and evaluation for, you know, small hospitals versus the kind of work that some of the larger hospitals can do to generate evidence about what are best practices in the first place. So I think those standards are very useful, and they ought to be adopted more widely, and that would be super beneficial, because just that first step, Nick Solovsky and other people's Foundation of Success used to argue that just getting people to elaborate what exactly you're doing and why do you think it works is a huge step that for decades we hadn't been doing in conservation. And I don't want to denigrate that or downweight that sort of enterprise. Absolutely essential to do that. What I'm trying to do is move strategically some organizations and projects farther along so we can do even better than that.
Okay, and I just want to cut in here, and I suggest one final short question so that I have a few minutes to market the next month's speaker.
Okay.
Perfect. So I will take the one that's probably summarize everything we have talked so far from McKinley Mazerol. How do you reconcile the climate emergency and the need to act as quickly as possible with the slow process of getting funding and executing experiment conservation research?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways. One, again, I'm trying with implementation science, I'm not talking about doing interventions and waiting years to see. I'm talking about embedding science in the implementation, where what we're trying to do is probe our underlying understanding of the systems. I'm not waiting to see the impacts on the climate. Clearly that's good. But we have ideas about, these are human-oriented problems about how humans are going to respond. When we push on levers in the system, if we've elaborated a causal pathway, there's going to be a bunch of intermediate steps. And we should be able to see it. That presentation that's going to be done in November did that, where they elaborated all the steps, and then they tried to see, are we getting those steps? They could actually look at the resource outcomes, but just verifying that we're actually, when we push on a lever, things respond in the way in which we think they do is huge. And when I was a grad student in the 90s, or when I was an undergrad in the 80s, people said the same thing. Species are going extinct. We have no time to wait for figure out whether these things work or not. And then 20, 30 years later, we're still having the same debates they had when I was an undergraduate about the best ways to engage in conservation. So for the climate change emergency, it's the same thing. We can't just learn by doing. These approaches do not work. We're going to be 10, 15 years from now, we're going to be stuck with the same debates that we're having now, because we haven't done work to verify that when we implement in a certain way, we're going to get these sorts of changes in the system.
Thank you, Paul. So now, Joanna, for concluding.
Yes, thank you. This was really interesting. And I realized with so many participants and so many good questions, it feels like we definitely would want to go on for forever. Unfortunately, we have to start closing for today. But before doing that, I just wanted to flag the speaker of next month. So Julia Jones will be speaking on does conservation work and how can we know it? So please do join us then, and I'm really touched by the amount of people that decided to show up today, and I hope that even if we didn't have time today to answer all the questions, I'm sure many of them will be recurring across the whole seminar series. So please do stay with us for these Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. And then finally, I would just like to to talk, Paul. Thank you to Paul for his brilliant talk, and to Seb for absolutely fabulous moderation of the chat window and the Q&A session. So yeah, that's all. Thank you, and see you in a month.